Hello, it's just David here with my weekly video. When Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code, came out, it caused quite a stir. It was a sort of a readable, fast-paced thriller that was an international bestseller. And, I read it myself. But one of the questions it posed, particularly to people of, Christian faith, was whether the historical background to it was true. It's to do with sort of the Knights Templars. Now, there was no question it had kind of been made a bit more racy for the sake of the plot. But of course, there was some sort of history behind it. Now, got to be careful what I say. I think probably not too much history, and why should it be? It was a novel, a work of fiction. It wasn't trying to be a sort of historical treatise. But as with most of historical novels, they kind of they bend the history a bit for the plot, but also, try and stay fairly faithful to what has happened. And that's probably true in Dan Brown's case. So nothing against him or against his book, though I'm not sure he terribly worries about what I think anyway. But one of the questions it sort of asked, I think, and it's what I want to talk about today, is sources. Because obviously most Christians would be familiar with the Bible. So when they want to know about Jesus, apart from the Old Testament, if they want to know about Jesus, they'll look to the Gospels and the other books of the New Testament, Acts of the Apostles, and then the letters, mainly written by St. Paul and one or two others. And they'll want to know, how reliable they are. And that's the sort of point of the controversy, really, that probably Christians know those books because we've been brought up by our Bibles. But of course, there's all sorts of books throughout history, some of them, very, very ancient, which talk about Jesus and about Christians and about all sorts of different faiths and sects and, heresies, or as they were later called, and different groups, etc., etc. And of course, Christians generally aren't familiar with those. They're the sort of preserve or scholars or historians. I haven't got really time to go into them now, and I'm not a great expert on them myself. But of course, the controversial bit of Dan Brown's book was saying, well, can we rely on the Gospels? Maybe they were trying to cover up something else, which this other literature kind of gives you a clue to, things like the Gnostic Gospels, for instance. Well, you can make what you will of the book and of the history. But really, the reason I'm saying this is that when we look at anything, the points, in a sense, raised by that argument are correct. When we're looking to find out what happened, we need to think, what are the sources? Who wrote this? When did they write it? Did they have any particular beef when they wrote it? And how close were they to the events that were described? Now, of course, even with the Gospels, we might not be able to answer that. Even Christians who've read the Gospels for many, many years might not be able to say, well, when were they written? Exactly who were the people writing for them? Indeed, did they have a beef? This is the point. Did they have something, a picture of Jesus they wanted to get over, as to some other views which perhaps didn't get included into the Bible? And that's where we get into the controversy. Now, of course, some of those aren't easy questions to answer. The dating of the Gospels is still a matter of controversy. But what we can say, for those of us who are sort of, if you like, an orthodox Christian faith, is that actually what we do know is that those documents were early and that they tended to be much more straightforward than later documents, particularly those sort of favoured by the Gnostics. And also that one of the criteria for selecting them was that they were by sort of eyewitnesses or one step removed from an eyewitness, so people quite close to the events. And that was some of the criteria. Now, I don't know it all, and I can't go into it all anyway, what I do know. But that was a sort of criteria people were thinking about even then. And certainly many of the sources, the slightly more fantastic sources that the sort of Dan Brown style people look at, tend to be later. They tend to be highly speculative, have all sorts of other things kind of going on in the background, and you know, certainly weren't written by people who are eyewitnesses to the events. As I say, I'm not, you know, particularly defending sort of the Orthodox Christian faith at this point. What I want us to think about is, you know, the sources of our information about particular events, how we get them, and how much we are judicial about sort of thinking about that. The reason I say all this is because you'll be unsurprised to know that this is a very contentious issue at the moment, and it's very contentious in what is happening in Ukraine, those tragic events. Now, there is obviously an awful just war going on, and whatever way you look at it, nobody denies that. There is enormous sort of military operation which is, you know, killing a large number of people and damaging a country enormously. There's no debate about that. What there is a debate about is how those events should be interpreted and understood. And of course, there is that second war of information. We have our preferred sources of information. Perhaps the BBC ranks up there pretty highly, but other things as well. But other people will have other sources of information. And of course, one of the things that the Russian government is trying to do is both A, provide their own sources of information, and also try to cut off others as well. And we know from what we have already read that, you know, this is a really important part of it. Many Russian soldiers, very young, perhaps very innocent, are going there thinking they're going to liberate and oppress people who will welcome them with open arms, or as surprised as anybody else to find the tragic truth of what is actually happening. But of course, as we know with other sort of recent events of sort of things about fake news and alternative truths and fact checking and all these sorts of things that become part of our language, particularly with the rise of social media, perhaps we have got into the habit of sort of not being terribly judicial in thinking about where we get our news from. Sometimes, you know, and it's, you know, fairly unimportant things, but, you know, we've read something on Facebook or seen this here, there, and everywhere. Perhaps it's been twisted about or whatever, you know, and, you know, that then becomes something we repeat, perhaps actually not checking it. Now, normally that's fairly innocent. It's just sort of a lot of it's fun, isn't it? Which is fine. I'm not terribly worried about that. A little sort of story goes round, but obviously at the moment it's a lot more serious. As I say, this is a second front to that very real war that's going on. I mean, many lives are going to depend on who, if you like, wins that information war. And I think, you know, it has brought some home truths to us. I mean, I have to say I am a fan of the BBC. And I think, you know, one of the signs that it is impartial is often it gets sort of criticised by everybody, which I always think is a very good sign, you know, politically in this country and abroad. And of course, the fact that the Russians are doing their best to stop anybody accessing the BBC is probably a good sign that it's doing its job very well. And of course, we've seen those fantastic reporters, I mean, not just the BBC, but others, but particularly the BBC, you know, who have actually been in sort of Kiev under fire reporting. So it's very difficult to sort of deny what they're saying. And also, I like it, you know, they, like many other agents, I tend to trust things which will admit when a story isn't confirmed, and we'll talk about unconfirmed reports, or this has not been verified, there is a claim by one side that this has happened. And I think when you get that sort of language, that's quite reassuring than just, you know, somebody that just pumps out what you think your audience wants to hear. So it's a tricky thing. But I do think, you know, and this is where, you know, doing our bit is so important, because I mean, we've seen that just, it's wonderful actually, but the extraordinary response we've seen to sort of goods and collections and you know, international support, but also very local support for the people of Ukraine has just been extraordinary. And I mean, sadly, in its sense, sort of, you know, a great thing, heartwarming. But I think perhaps one of the things we have to do is to learn to be a bit discerning about where we get our news from, and what and just even with those things that we trust, take them, just have a little poke and see, where is this news coming from? And again, the same thing as the Gospels, actually. Is it eyewitness? Is it written just as the events are happening? Do these people have a particular beef or a viewpoint that they want to get over? And if so, what is it? And who is sort of verifying these reports that they're getting out, where they haven't got eyewitness observers on the ground? So I think in terms of supporting Ukraine in that war, we are going to have to be a bit discerning. I mean, it sounds a bit of an academic exercise, I know, but I think kind of we owe it from the people of Ukraine that wherever we get our news from, we do continue to ask these questions. And because behind them lie important issues of truth. And frankly, behind those issues of truth lie matters of life and death on quite a large scale. So perhaps a rather sobering and thing that we need to do for those of us who, we all enjoy a sort of silly, scandalous story in the tabloids. There's nothing wrong with that, mostly. But I think, this is serious. We need to ask questions, and we need to think about what is the truth of what's going on. Thank you.